What if I told you that the United States may not actually be experiencing a decline, but rather undergoing a radical transformation? And during this transformation, it will be handing over control of its geopolitical interests, if it hasn't already done so, to the big tech AI oligarchs and, more crucially, to the Jewish Zionists of Israel. This is a fascinating question to consider. If you've seen any of my previous podcast discussions, you will know that I've posed the question to several of my guests, most notably Raja Abdul Haq, about whether or not the tail wags the dog, or in other words, if Israel is in control of the US decision-making process in regards to foreign policy in the Middle East. Now, I'm no expert, but from what I understand about the way the US maintains its power around the globe, it does so through a balancing act, ensuring that no one nation becomes powerful enough to establish itself as a regional hegemon capable of resisting US interests, or potentially even kicking it out entirely. Now, if this theory is correct, of the United States engaging in a balancing act between powers that are either allies with them or competing with them in any given region, then it would help explain why the United States would disrupt the Nord Stream pipeline, for example, between Germany and Russia, even though it would provide the European Union, an allied bloc of the US, with cheap energy to power its economies and maintain political stability. By severing the economic relationship between Germany and Russia, however, the US ensures that neither nation can become too economically, politically, or militarily powerful enough to threaten their interests on the continent. In the Middle East, however, this theory is tested and potentially even breaks down. Now, it's no secret that the US has worked to reduce Iran's influence in the region, slowly chipping away at its power in Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and Iraq. But many have argued that the US have gone beyond just limiting Iran's influence in order to reestablish balance in the region, and has actually undermined its own interests in the region by clearing the path of any competition for Israel to not only survive in the region, but to actually dominate it. The reason this would undermine the US's interests is because if Israel could become powerful enough to be completely independent of the United States, it could then make decisions that advance its own interests at the expense of the United States. With the power of the Israeli lobby and intelligence blackmail operations through the Mossad and other institutions, Israel has demonstrated a unique ability to bend decision makers to their will, not just in Congress, but in the Pentagon as well. Now, with this theory in mind, I came across a fascinating series of tweets by Professor David Miller, the British sociologist and geopolitical analyst who was unjustly fired by Brighton University for criticizing Zionist crimes, elaborating on this theory and arguing that Israel does indeed have control of US foreign policy and is extracting even more control day by day as it seeks to establish its own empire via proxy as a sort of virus in the host body of a giant superpower. Now, this is difficult for people to wrap their heads around because when they think of Greater Israel, they think of it as contained to the region of the Middle East. However, as Professor David Miller points out, it's actually expanding its influence and power far beyond the borders of the Middle East in a way that ensures that its empire of control has room to grow. Quote, Greater Israel does not just cover the Levant and the Arabian Peninsula. What we are seeing today under the Trump regime is a handover of US imperial power to a new Jewish empire for whom the US is merely a client state. This has been facilitated by Trump personally over his 2 terms and by the numerous Zionist assets around him, not least in his own family, such as Jared Kushner. The new Jewish empire, working with the UAE, seeks to dominate ports and infrastructure across the Swahili coast, the Horn of Africa, and Central Africa, where it is involved in the plunder of oil, gold, and rare minerals. To strengthen its grip on its target colonies, the new Jewish empire has this week imported dozens of social media influencers, especially from the US and UK, 2 of its most important colonies. Here we see the popular Swahili gospel singer Christina Shusho participating in this week's propaganda exercise, through which she will continue to be an instrument of radicalizing Tanzanians and Kenyans in the cause of Jewish supremacism and colonial plunder across East Africa. In this tweet here, a user comments, "The UK and US aren't colonies of Israel. The US has the world's largest economy with 750 plus military bases and global hegemony. Colony implies dependence, but Washington funds and arms Israel. The US isn't handing over anything to anyone. Power flows from the US, not to it." In response, David Miller wrote this, "Imperial history is dynamic, and those socialist anti-imperialists who cling to an outmoded idea of empire which does not account for Zionism as a unique ideological and power phenomenon are bound to be both lost in the New World and to make catastrophic decisions, just as some parts of the Islamic resistance outside of Gaza have done in recent years." Alright, I know that was a very long introduction, but I wanted to set the stage for you. So, I'd like you to join me now in welcoming Professor David Miller to elaborate on this idea further. further.
I wanted to interview you about these tweets that you've been putting out about the Jewish empire. So,
Okay.
as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand it, you're arguing that the United States, in Donald Trump's first and now his second term, has been preparing to sort of hand over portions of its empire, specifically in the Middle East, to Israel. Is that the correct way to summarize this argument you've been putting out about the Jewish empire?
Well, look, what I would say is that things are changing in the world. Okay, so let's start off with the basics. The basics is that there's a Zionist occupation in Palestine since the establishment of the so-called State of Israel in 1948, and since that time, they've always wanted, and in fact, before then, they've always wanted to create a greater Israel, Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, which of course stretches way beyond the territory of Mandate Palestine, including, of course, all of Gaza and the West Bank, of Syria, of Lebanon, of Jordan, of part of Egypt, a part of Iraq, even the top part of Turkey in some iterations. So that's what they've always wanted to do, but now that looks like it's becoming something of a reality. So that would mean, of course, increased occupation. Of course, they went into Lebanon last year. They were beaten back by Hezbollah, but they retained some extra lands. They already were occupying part of Lebanon. They're now occupying part of Syria. They've collapsed the Syrian government, and Syria now is a client state. And they're trying their best to intervene in Iraq and in other places as well. So that's what we sort of knew before about the intention to create a greater Israel, which is, I mean, it's in Zionist writings for many, many years. But what we're also seeing, I think, is two things. On the one hand, first of all, the question of the West. And it relates to this question of the so-called tail wagging the dog, right? So leftists say, based on their particular understanding of Marxist theory, that imperialism is in charge, meaning, of course, in this day and age, US imperialism, and it cannot be the case that the tail, Israel, the Zionist colony, can wag the dog. And therefore, people who make this kind of argument are not sufficiently Marxist, not really leftists, maybe they're even anti-Semites. That's the kind of argument you get. I've been accused of this kind of stuff for a long time, even though, of course, my sociological background is in historical materialism. So what we have to say about that, I think, is that what we have seen over the last 30 or 40 years is an increasing influence of the Zionists on both foreign and domestic policy. Yes, in the US, in the UK, in France, Germany, and many other Western countries. And you see that through, in particular, the case of the US is best known, I suppose, through the influence of what were called the neoconservatives in the period of the 1980s through to the invasion of Iraq, etc., over foreign domestic policy in the Pentagon, in the CIA, in the Treasury Department, actually, and in other parts of US governmental apparatus, as well as in emergingly in domestic policy. So in the policy in relation to the universities and other things. So, and the obvious example, which is an obvious slam dunk, but there are many more examples you could give, is the adoption in the US and many other countries of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism, which of course is a Mossad-originated definition and is an instrument of Israeli foreign policy. So that allows them to have a certain level of, let's say, influence, let's not say control for the moment, over both internal and external policy. And so that means that the metaphor of the tail wagging the dog becomes difficult because, of course, the Zionist movement is not just people. I got criticised by a Jewish leftist group called Judas some time ago for having these mad conceptions of what the Zionist movement was. I thought it was all these mad things like interfaith work and chicken soup in mosques and all sorts of other things. They said, no, the Zionist movement is the Israeli government and the IDF. So I wrote an article about it in relation to the UK. So, well, let's count up the number of Zionist organizations there are in the UK, and we got to formal Zionist organizations, 122 or so, and then informally Zionist, i.e., not part of the World Zionist Organization, some 3,000 in the UK. In the US, it must be more than 10,000 easily. I mean, there are 1,300 branches of Chabad Lubavitch in the US, so you've already got 1,300 Zionist organizations. Never mind the rest of them. So the metaphor begins to collapse because the Zionist movement is not just in the Zionist colony, it's also inside America, inside the policy-making apparatus of government departments, as everyone knows who's paid any attention to the last 40 years through Feith and Wolfowitz and their Mark Dick Cheney, who of course died just the other day. And so you have to, the metaphor you would have to adapt. You would have to say, well, yeah, it's quite a heavy tale, admittedly, but it's also a question of what is colonizing and influencing and perhaps controlling the vital organs of the dog. And that's what we see in the West, that there is at least very strong influence, if not effectively control over the way in which foreign domestic policy is operated in France, Germany, the UK, the US, and many other Western countries. So that's the first thing I see. That looks like people are calling this an occupation. People on the left are calling this an occupation by the Zionists of Western institutions. That's the first thing I would say. Did you want to ask me a question?
Yeah, I was just going to pause you for a moment and say that all of this is obviously very interesting. And I had a discussion about this with an American Palestinian activist, Rajab Abdul Haq. And in our podcast, we were going back and forth where I was arguing that there was a legitimate argument to make about the fact that the Zionists control U.S. foreign policy, at least in the Middle East. And his argument, of course, was that you can't take away from American imperialism that they have been doing this all over the world, and how can you explain their behaviors that are very similar to what they're doing in the Middle East to, let's say, what they've been doing to Venezuela and what they're currently trying to do to Venezuela, that it isn't just the presence of Israel. And he talked about all these different institutions like the Pentagon, et cetera, et cetera. But what I pointed out is that institutions like the Pentagon are just buildings. Inside the buildings are people. And as we've seen, the people inside the building are increasingly Zionist Jews. So, for example, Laura Loomer is now part of the press corps in the Pentagon, and that's just one very small example. She obviously doesn't have any control. She's just running their propaganda. But, the Biden's administration, I think like 67% of the staff in his administration were Zionist Jews, not even like Christian Zionists. They were Zionist Jews, and they were making the decision making. They were, in control of decision making.
Yes.
Go ahead. Sorry.
So let me keep talking about the West, because there's another point to make about the West, and then we'll come to the rest of West Asia, and indeed beyond that into Africa and East Asia.
Okay.
So the other thing is that we I think haven't understood in terms of what I would call infiltration. Is it's not just that Zionist Jews have high up positions in government policy making and the apparatus of Treasury, of Pentagon, of CIA, of State Department. It's also that there is a deliberate attempt by the State of Israel to infiltrate industry in Western and indeed other countries for the benefit of Israeli foreign policy interests. And they do that, of course. I mean, the most obvious way. The first thing to say, of course, is that there's the global network of Mossad's little helpers, the Sayanim, right, who are people who are largely Jews who are called upon by the Mossad to do work for them when they have operations in those countries. So that's relatively well known. But the more important one, I think, in terms of the infiltration of policy in the private sector, is in particular the infiltration of the tech firms. So many of these tech firms, in the UK, there's a thing called the UK Israel Tech Hub, which is funded by the British government, based in the British Embassy in Tel Aviv, and which helps to promote Israeli tech firms in the UK to get business, etc. Now, of course, we know that there are, according to them, 440 Israeli tech firms active in the UK, just. I don't think anyone even knows the names of all these companies. And that, of course, is different. And in addition to the involvement of tech firms in government, in private and public contracts in the UK, of course, in the US too, from big multinational tech firms which are run by Zionists. Oracle is the most obvious one, run by our friend Larry Ellison, who, of course, is through his various companies, has now taken over TikTok and the US and CBS, etc. Everyone knows about these things, right? So that involvement of tech companies, which are either Israeli or run by Zionist oligarchs, is really very important. Not just because of the contracts that they get and the national security data they may have access to, but precisely because people at the top of these companies are very largely former, I mean, of course, put former in inverted commas, former members of Unit 8200, which is the Israeli military's signals intelligence unit, the same as GCHQ in the US, sorry, in the UK, and the National Security Agency in the US. So that's another infiltration tactic used by the Zionists to access materials, including for surveillance and for spying, and control. So Oracle has multi-billion contracts for providing the cloud services for the Ministry of Defence in the UK, the Foreign Office in the UK, the Home Office. These are the three government departments which control all of the intelligence agencies in this country, and of course also in the National Health Service, which is a very valuable asset for which the companies want to access. Now, do we imagine that none of this goes back to the Mossad and to Unit 8200? Do we really believe that? So that's another element of it. But the other element I wanted to talk about, the further element beyond just the tech firms, is the question of the more general infiltration of Zionist Jews across the society. Okay, so Zionist Jews, you mentioned about the overrepresentation of Zionist Jews amongst Biden staff now, but Zionist Jews, and almost all Jews are Zionists, not all of them are anti-Zionist Jews, but they tend not to be in these positions, are overrepresented across the whole of the society. In the US and the UK and many other places. I mean, the top 10% of the world's billionaires are Jewish. And I challenge you, tell me which of those, I think it's 257, makes up 10% in the last Forbes data, and there's live Forbes data on this, you can check every day. Tell me which of those is an anti-Zionist. And of course, the answer you'll get is someone will say, George Soros. and of course, that's the best you've got, George Soros. And of course, George Soros is famously funds J Street, which is the organization which is providing the secretariat for the new mayor of New York, of course. And he is manifestly a Zionist of a certain kind. So that there's an infiltration. I wrote an article about this on my press recently. An infiltration across the whole of the society, because the Zionist movement trains this young from the age of 3 and 4 to be loyal genocide heirs wherever they find themselves in the society. And because Jews are more socially advantaged in every society than white people, like than every ethnic or religious minority, and indeed more advantaged than white people in the US and in the UK, then that means that they have an inbuilt demographic advantage in pursuing Zionist aims later in life. Now, of course, that would be great if the majority of them became anti-Zionist, and that could make a real difference. But they're not presently majority anti-Zionist. They're presently overwhelming majority Zionist. So that's the other way in which infiltration works, which people don't think about. It's that there are people across the public and the private sectors who, when the tap comes on the shoulder, they will know. They won't even need to be tapped on the shoulder to do the right thing for Israel. And that, of course, means that that's part of the reason why there's this kind of occupation in the West, and it's very difficult to take even moderate measures to boycott or divest from Zionist pension funds or shares or anything, even in public institutions. It's very, very difficult because there's this pushback in every institution. I know in my own case at the University of Bristol, when I was there was a campaign, an external campaign, to sack me, and a campaign by Zionist student groups. There was also, of course, a phalanx of people inside the university, Zionist Jews, who wanted me to be sacked. And of course, I had no idea there was so many Zionists in my university until, of course, the letter came in with 50 or 60 of them had signed it. And that's the same across all institutions, especially at the higher levels. So that's what I would say about the West, that we no longer have a clear sense that these things that are being done for the interests of US imperialism, or indeed British imperialism, if there remains such a thing. And you can argue about that. So I think that's the first thing to say. But the second thing to say is that there's an emerging set of circumstances which shows that there are attempts at Zionist influence in other places, not just in the Greater Israel, but also through normalization in West Asia, which of course is led with the Zionists by the United Arab Emirates, has been for some 17 or 18 years now. And coming along second and pretending not to be involved for many years is the Saudi regime, which is involved in normalization, and other regimes as well, including, of course, Bahrain and to some extent Qatar. So that's all happening as well, and that shows the way in which a Greater Israel is something which is not just about the direct occupation of the whole of West Asia, because of course part of the problem with that is that there aren't enough Jews to do that. So they have to have other methods of control, and of course they do that through proxies and assets and people who will be their vassals in the way that we think of countries like that being the vassals of US imperialism or previously British imperialism. So that's West Asia, but that's also not something which is confined to West Asia. It's also in North Africa and indeed in East Africa. And we've seen recently the conflict in Sudan, which involves the UAE, which is effectively operating as a sub-imperial power, but as a proxy in some ways of the Israelis. And we see the same in Somaliland, a state which has been effectively created for the purposes of advancing Zionist military and foreign policy objectives in East Africa. And of course, you see that across North Africa too, especially in Morocco, where the secret police were set up by the Mossad some decades ago. And Morocco has been very loyal to the Zionist project throughout this period. And we also see it, I think, in East Asia, where, I mean, this is a slightly more complicated set of questions, but let's take the example of Taiwan. We have just done a show on that for Palestine Declassified, which will be out at the weekend. Now, Taiwan is a country which is not recognized by anybody, any state. It's not, of course, recognized by the People's Republic of China, which regards it as simply a province of China, which of course is correct. It is part of China and should be, in my view, forthwith taken back. But anyhow, there we have Taiwan, which was the bolt hole for the Kuomintang, the counter-revolutionaries led by Chiang Kai-shek, and which became a democracy in 1987, had an economic miracle, is now one of the world's leading providers of semiconductors. And of course, it's been difficult since China developed diplomatic relationships with Israel in 1992 for Israel to have a direct diplomatic presence there. And of course, we might come back to the fact that China recognized the state of Israel in 1992, because that's also part of this story, along with the relationship with Russia. But let's stay with Taiwan for the moment. So there is an Israeli industrial office in Taiwan, and just the other week, 2 weeks ago now, the first ever APAC delegation came to Taiwan. 200 people. The names of two of them were publicized. The other 198, we've no idea who they were. And of course, this is about finding ways for Israel and the US, well, Israel and the Taiwanese to cooperate, and they have been cooperating in many ways, which I'll mention in a second. Now, the president welcomed the APAC delegation. He made a speech emphasizing the David and Goliath struggle of the Zionists and US, Israel, and Taiwanese cooperation, especially in the areas of semiconductors for military purposes and, of course, in cybersecurity. And we know that Taiwan has been supplying information and products to and components to Elbit, to Rafael, and to Israel Aerospace Industries, three of the biggest arms firms in the colony. And we know that Israel has been helping Taiwan to develop its own so-called Iron Dome, a version of the Zionists' Iron Dome technology. So we know that those relationships have been going on covertly because, of course, the Chinese look askance at such things and they shouldn't really be happening. And of course, we also know that through the involvement in cybersecurity, that there are also Israeli tech firms active in Taiwan, which of course means Unit 8200. So we know that there are Israeli intelligence people active there. So there's a strong relationship, has been for some time, between Taiwan, which is now effectively becoming a support state for Israel. And there is now, since 2011, a Zionist movement based in Taiwan. Now, there are only several thousand Jews in Taiwan, which has grown in the last decade and a half. They make up about 0.001% of the population, so very, very few. There are two synagogues, both of which are Zionist. Chabad opened an office there in 2011. There's now a Jewish community center, which is, of course, Zionist, and which was involved in bringing the APAC delegation. So we see the beginnings of the Zionist movement internal to Taiwan. And of course, they do what the Zionist movement does everywhere, which is they train their young to believe that Jews have a right to steal Palestinian land and kill Palestinians. And they were involved, for example, in the B'nai B'rith Youth Organization Asia Pacific Conference in 2024. So there's a lot going on there, and we see that when you look at any other country. I mean, Taiwan's is an exception because it's so pro-Israel because of its relationship with China and its attempts to defend itself. But if you look at any other country, you find similarly that there are these two sets of influences. There's a Zionist movement of varying sizes and varying histories, and there is, of course, the industrial and the arms links between those countries and the Zionists, and which also involves, of course, Israeli intelligence. Now, so that seems to me to be something which is suggestive of the increasing role and the emerging role of Israel as a world power. Not only do they colonize and have great influence, let's not say control, over Western foreign and domestic policy, but they're also effectively colonizing and turning other states into vassals, which can make them an imperial power. And that's why we can talk, I think, of the beginnings of what we would call Pax Judaica, which is, I think, replacing Pax Americana. Now, of course, Pax, that phrase, Pax Britannica, Pax Americana, Pax Judaica, that's a phrase which suggests a global hegemon, which is able to impose peace on the world or stability of some sort for a significant number of years, or for an era, let's say, as we've seen with Pax Americana since 1945. But of course, it doesn't mean actual peace. It doesn't mean either social peace in the relevant hegemon, the state of the hegemon, or nor does it mean international peace. Of course, all the way through this period, we saw the decolonization processes leading to the emergence of independent countries from Britain in the post-45 period, including, of course, China, which we've been talking about. And we also have seen that long list. I mean, people put out that list, don't they? Of these are the countries that China has invaded in the last 50 years, and here's the number of countries invaded by the US, sometimes repeatedly. So we know that that doesn't mean peace, but it means hegemony. It means control. It means that Israel is becoming a pole of influence, which it never was before. And I think that is something which is which is happening. But I think that to take that down a step, I think what we should be thinking about is that a reasonable theory? Does it match the evidence, or is it still the case that the Americans are in charge, that the Americans make Netanyahu do this? And I would say, to test that theory, and I suppose maybe this is a way of putting it. Look, the Marxist theory is only of any merit or use in the world if it's testable. Marx was an empirical sociologist. He wasn't just a theoretician. He wasn't Louis Althusser. He was somebody who believed in going and doing research and finding out what was happening. And that seems to me to be the key to the extent to which Marxist theory is of any merit to the world or to people struggling in the world. And that is if it's testable and falsifiable. Now, I would say that, the one way to look at that is to say, yes, we should look at Zionist influence in America and Britain, etc. But we should also ask the other question, because maybe it's the case that that the US is influencing the Zionists, is making the Zionists do X and Y. And of course, we hear this. Many people say that, well, all Trump's got to do is click his fingers, make the phone call, and Netanyahu will do what he tells him. And of course, there's an extent to which we know that the Trump administration have been pretending that that's the case for propaganda advantage. I think people generally recognize that's true. But look, who is it? Which American organizations have been involved in trying to influence Israeli politics? I mean, maybe I've missed them all. But when you start to look at that, it's a very small list. There is a way in which America tries to influence. There's two ways, I would say. One is, of course, by supplying weapons. And of course, that helps the US weapons industry. And the other is through direct involvement in covert operations in Israel. Now, what we know about that is that the CIA doesn't involve itself. The kind of liberal Zionist wing of the CIA does involve itself in Israel. It has been funding protests against Netanyahu. Yeah, the CIA does help to fund investigations, for example, of the NSO group, which runs Pegasus spy software. The best investigations of that have been done by an organization which is effectively funded by the CIA. So we know that the CIA is involved in trying to destabilize some elements of the Netanyahu regime. And maybe there's more that we don't know about. That's plausible. But is there a US lobby in occupied Palestine? I'm not aware of that. If there was, then that would help to push back against the kind of argument that I'm making.
So this is all very interesting. There's a lot to unpack here. I guess, so when people hear the word empire and they hear terms like colonialism, they imagine like British troops going, sailing around the world, settling onto an island, winning a couple battles, occupying that area, and then subjugating the people and forcing them to extract resources that they then import back to Britain that Britain wouldn't have naturally on their own. In this case, I think maybe people potentially struggle with trying to understand a Jewish or Israeli or Zionist empire because they think, well, we don't see Israeli troops physically occupying different parts of the world, or even, outside of Syria or Lebanon. We don't see them in the UAE, or we don't see them in Saudi Arabia. We don't see them in Iraq, and so they can't imagine, I guess, the empire manifesting itself. But what you're describing is a different kind of colonialism where they are infiltrating through covert means, through business, through intelligence, the Mossad infiltrating, and they're able to wrestle control of significant industries. So you mentioned that the Israelis don't have the numbers, right, to like actually physically occupy these different parts of the region, specifically in the Middle East. It made me think of this interview where Jake Shields, he's this, I don't know if you've come across him on X, but his tweets go viral all the time. He's an America firster. He was a former UFC fighter. People call him an anti Semite. He doesn't have any problem being called an anti Semite. He interviewed, I believe, a Zionist Jew who runs the Twitter account Awesome Jew. And he asked him specifically about the Greater Israel Project. And he told him that you shouldn't be worried about us carrying out the Greater Israel Project because it doesn't require us to physically occupy those parts of the region because we don't have the numbers. And so he was trying to say that it's not a bad thing and it's not going to happen the way that you're imagining. And he was arguing that it's already happening now, that we already have different actors in the region subjugated to us, and they essentially serve the Israelis and they serve the Zionists. So how can you describe the Jewish empire without sounding like Henry Ford? Talking about what's his famous book, talking about the international Jew or the global Jew. So and there's a big debate happening now where a lot of anti-Zionist Jews are kind of concerned about the language being used, right? And they say, they're trying to play by, I guess, rules that are about 10 or 15 years old when Palestine activism was contained to these very small groups where it was basically like Jewish Voice for Peace and leftist anti-Zionist Jews and Palestine activists talking about Palestine, and that was it. But now, obviously, many people are talking about it. You have America Firsters, and they're saying the problem, it's not just Zionism, that, it's Jews, essentially. And so people feel very uncomfortable with this conversation. I guess what I'm trying to say is that the lines are blurred between anti-Zionist and essentially anti-Jewish language a little bit. And Nick Fuentes has become incredibly popular. Right now, he's been waging a war on the right, against the right, for 2 years now, and he's winning. Every few months, there's a major conservative influencer or journalist or important figure that switches and essentially, platforms Fuentes, and he's just chipping away at them, and the Zionists are losing their mind over it. This is a long-winded rant, but I guess, how can you describe the Jewish empire without it sounding anti-Semitic? And I guess, how can people think of this empire and how it might manifest itself differently, where the U.S. is going all around the world with their aircraft carriers? The Israelis aren't going to do that, but they're obviously going to, carry out their imperial ambitions in some kind of way. So, yeah, those are two questions.
First thing to say is about aircraft carriers. So aircraft carriers are clearly an implement of the projection of power. That's their intended function. But they appear to be on the way out as an implement of projection of power. But nevertheless, we can say that, if we're saying that the Zionists have significant influence in the foreign domestic policies of the US and the UK, well, the aircraft carriers are working for Israel. So yes, they will need to project power, but they will have proxies and allies to do it, which will be run, effectively by Zionist Jews inside the administration. So that explains quite a lot of that. But there's other things you can say. I mean, this whole question about using the word Jew, when people started to use the word Jew, you realized that there was a kind of omerta on using the word, which we didn't have with the word Muslim or the word Protestant or Catholic. And that's a bit of a wake-up call for many people. But I would say some other things. One is that when we're talking about a Jewish empire, we're talking about Jewish supremacists, of which Zionists are a key component. Zionists are by definition Jewish supremacists. And people get even concerned about that. There's been cases in the UK where people have been stopped by the police, and the famous case of Dr. Rama Al Adwan who was arrested for using the phrase Jewish supremacy. Now, as if what that means is all Jews are supremacists. Well, of course, it doesn't mean that. I mean, you don't think that when you say Aryan supremacy or Protestant supremacy. Uh, so the way to think about this is to think about it in relation to other similar circumstances. Now, it might be that the history of the Jews and the history of the Protestants and the history of the Muslims is different in some ways, but you can see that in previous examples of settler colonialism, that religion has played a key role as a marker of difference, and that's the case in relation to Zionism. The Zionists think of themselves as being Jews. I don't know if you've noticed that. That's what they think of themselves. And they think of themselves as being legitimated by their Judaism, by the Torah and the Talmud, and what God promised them, etc. All of that stuff. They think of themselves as being religiously legitimated. Now, that doesn't mean to say that, as materialist scholars, we should think that it's a religious problem. But we do understand that that's how they use the ideas of Judaism, their religion, to justify dispossession colonialism. And that was the same in South Africa. I mean, if you look up the relationship between the Protestant Church and the Boers of South Africa, there's a very close and interesting relationship about the promised land and who was to be given the promised land in Southern Africa. And the same, of course, is the case in the north of Ireland, where Protestant supremacy organises to this day. Every summer they have their big marches, the 12th of July March, run by the Orange Order, which is a Protestant supremacist organisation, entirely legal in the north of Ireland, and indeed in the UK they have marches in Glasgow, where I'm from, every year. Incredible that they should be allowed, but it is allowed. And these are Protestant supremacists. But people don't say, "Oh, you're anti-Protestant. Look at this. This is a form of racism against Protestants." And that's an illustration of the way in which there's such a sensitivity about Jewishness. And of course, we understand what the reasons are. The reasons are that sensitivity came about as a result of the Second World War and what came to be the common and settled understanding of what happened in what's called the Holocaust, capital H. So I think that, of course, people are concerned about that, and they are concerned that the right is engaging in this debate, and of course, in their heads they think, well, the right, these people are just anti-Semites, and we should have nothing to do with them. And I think that it's a mistake to think like that. It's a mistake to think that the Jews have particular sensibilities which we should not offend in a way which we would be happy to offend the sensitivities of Catholics or Hindus or Muslims or Protestants. And I think that is an illustration, really, of the way in which Zionism has been able to, colonize certain elements of the left, and in particular in the UK, which I know best, but probably also the US, to colonize the anti-racist movement. So that the idea of the anti-racist movement, most of the anti-racist movement in this country since the 1940s, has wanted to focus predominantly and preeminently on fascism, on fighting the neo-Nazis, and not on fighting the main way in which racism expresses itself in our society, in the UK. It's the case, and I think that's also true in the US, which is through state and institutional racism, which is against black people and then subsequently against Muslims, because Muslims are the preeminent enemy of the empire. I'm using the word deliberately neutrally there. And of course, we can go back and look at the way in which Muslims became the primary enemy and the role of Zionism in encouraging those ideas. But let's bracket that off for a second. So anti-racist movements have wanted to have a unity against fascism and the far right. And the reason for that is because if you start to look at the main forms of racism in the society, state racism, institutional racism, you start also to think about imperialism and colonialism and about that word, which indicates the involvement of Jews in racism, and that word, of course, is Zionism. And the price for involving Jews in the anti-racist movement was that we couldn't talk about Zionism. We couldn't talk about that Zionism was racism, and we couldn't talk about the predominant form of racism being anti-black and then anti-Muslim racism coming from the state and counterterrorism, the counterterrorism apparatus. And I think that that's part of the reason that people feel this awkwardness, because they've inherited from the past very strong left-wing ideas about what anti-racism is and what anti-fascism is, and I think that's something which we don't understand enough. Were themselves colonized by the Zionist movement in the actually before the 1970s. In the 70s, the main anti-racist groups in this country, Rock Against Racism, the Anti-Nazi League, they were effectively colonized by the Zionists. But that colonization had started a long way before, back in the 1940s and 50s. So I think that's part of the reason why people get concerned about it. But I don't think there's any reason to be intrinsically concerned about talking about the role of religion in imperialism, because clearly in other settler colonial situations, it's had a key role. And I believe that's also the case in Algeria, although I know much less about Algeria than I do about South Africa or Zimbabwe and Palestine and Ireland. But clearly, when you read Fanon about the Algerian situation, and in fact, that was one of the places I got some of my earliest understanding of the whole question of the veil and the hijab and how it plays a role in imperial policy from Fanon's work on that. So that clearly was also an issue there as well.
It's interesting when you talk about the role of religion in imperialism, because as I understand it, one of the ways empires or states try to prove themselves superior is to say we have the superior God as well. And there's always a competition, like in the different pantheons of who has the superior God. And if you look at the rhetoric that the Zionists are using on X, and that they're pushing even Christian Zionists to say, is if you are against Zionism, you are against God Himself, or the Israeli God is the greater God. Jesus Himself was a Zionist. Like your God was a Zionist. Like there is no Christianity without us. We're the superior religion. We have the superior God. And one of that manifests itself with when Christian politicians go to Israel. You don't see them going to visit the church. You see them touching the wall. Yeah. And they all, bow down to Jewish power in that regard. And so that's interesting. I wanted to ask you now. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. It sounds like you have a comment to make about that.
Well, no, I mean, I think it's. I think we are going through a period where we're starting to reevaluate some of the many. Well, on the left at least, some of the many long-held leftist ideas about the relationship between religion, capitalism, and imperialism and racism, and I think that is, of course, has been brought on by the brute fact of the genocide. So many more people now see that at a very minimum, Zionism is racism. It always will be, and than saw before. So we're in a period where new questions are starting to be asked, and so people whose views were regarded as being completely outside the realm of the discussable those views are no longer regarded as being from the beginning ideas you can discuss or consider or look at. And so I think that's in a way, although it might be regarded as dangerous by some people, I think in the end we have to find ways to explain and understand the mass death of children in Palestine. I mean, because it's not explicable by our current ways of understanding.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I want to ask you about this normalization. So obviously we know that Saudi Arabia, just as one of the actors, but there are several actors in the region, they have stated that they won't normalize with Israel unless there's a Palestinian state, but they also kind of want to just quiet down this genocide, slow it down, I guess you could say, and have some kind of Palestinian Authority recognized as a state not because it's actually going to be an independent state, but just so they can finally come out and say, we're normalizing, let's get to business. And they're already doing that business, but they want to increase and escalate that. And they want to make it public, and they want to be able to tell their people, even though they're too busy partying and engaging in consumerism and materialism, they want to tell them that, hey, look, yeah, we're doing business with the Israelis now. We just want to let you know. But it's okay because we finally got a Palestinian state and it's all good. Um, so how can you explain, I guess, the Zionist reluctance to even do that, which you would imagine is actually in their interests to some extent? Like why are if I don't know if it's just the Likud party or what, but why are the Israelis reluctant to even do that, even though you could argue that it's actually in their interests?
Well, I mean, those who want to normalize outside of occupied Palestine, the Saudis, the UAE, they are keen to do it in a way which brings along others who are not so keen, meaning other Arab states. There's of course a division within the Zionists about what should be allowed and what shouldn't be allowed, and they they argue amongst themselves and they try and work out what they want and how best to pursue it. And of course, they represent those who are arguing with them as being, a block on progress or whatever it is. And there's there's a little bit of smoke and mirrors about that. Well, it's quite a lot of smoke and mirrors about that. But look, I think that the idea of the Palestinian state of some sort is regarded as being a way for for some elements of the Arab world to get involved in a way which they wouldn't otherwise, and to get the cash flowing. But of course, what they want to do is they want to create, as everyone's already said, a kind of Bantustan, which isn't a proper state, which doesn't have any power, which will be run by, probably it will be run by Mohammed Dalan, who is of course Palestinian, but who is involved who works today in the UAE for the UAE's intelligence service, and his bosses Tanoon bin Zayed, the brother of MBZ. So that's part of what their plan is, that they want to themselves to have a role in running what would be the Palestinian state in a way which is not a threat to Israel, which has no independent foreign or defense policy, can't have an airport, etc. I mean, not state, a Bantustan. So, but the Saudis find it difficult to do that without being able to show some kind of progress, and they want to show progress to the Arab Union and to bring other Arab states on board, and to make it into something which they can make money out of. And of course, they're at the same time working with Kushner, have been for many years now, in the Saudi wealth, what's it, Saudi Sovereign Fund or something it's called, which have paid him billions and billions of dollars, and it's part of this plan to build beachfront apartments in Gaza, along with Tony Blair and his foundation, which of course is bankrolled by Larry Ellison to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars in the last few years. So it's a complex thing. They have to bring some people in to this Pax Judaica, well, I put it that way, in order to expand its power. So there's a balancing act for some of them.
I see. So, how likely is the Jewish empire to succeed? Are you arguing that it's already here and it's yet to reveal itself to the world publicly, or is it still facing opposition?
Well, when did the American empire reveal itself? They always said, we're not an empire, we're an anti-imperialist country. We rid ourselves of the yoke of British colonialism. We don't invade other countries, we don't invade and occupy. And so there's always been a thing about American exceptionalism, which is that they're not an imperial power. So I think that they're not going to say, oh well, we're. I mean, some of them do say we are in charge. I mean,
Yeah.
people like Rabbi Shmuley and and others, they already say it. But no, I mean they're not going to say that they're an empire. This is an emergent project, and you have to look at the extent to which um, things don't go their way. Now, I think that they have been very successful in the last 2 years in pursuing their objectives. They've collapsed the government of Bashar al-Assad. They have gone into Lebanon. They've collapsed effectively the capacity of Hezbollah to wage war. I mean, although they are rearming, they will leave Hezbollah to be finished off by the Americans, probably. And so, because they're a proxy, the Americans are a proxy of the Zionist regime in this instance, and so they're not going to admit to anything necessarily, but they are, in process of being able to dominate regional and to some extent international agendas. Where is the evidence that they are being stopped from what they're wanting to do? So that's one thing I would say. That's the maximalist position on what's the current state of Pax Judaica. On the other hand, they have had some failures whenever they fight with the Palestinian resistance or with Hezbollah or indeed with Iran. They lose. They don't do very well with direct involvement, but they're able to wield power in other ways, and we saw that with the advent to power of Jilani, their stooge in Syria, and they now control a third of the south of a third of Syria, and they have security control up to and beyond Damascus, and that will those kinds of activities will continue. They don't face any threat from Egypt or from Jordan. There's still potentially a threat from Iraq, they've done badly when they come into direct conflict. But when they are able to manipulate politics and society and to use their proxies, then they've done very well. Now, the only thing which really stands in their way is what's left of the axis of resistance. And looking at the axis of resistance now, whatever one might think of its military strength, it's pretty plain that it's suffered a defeat. Even although the Israelis had to go to Iran to ask them to stop in the 12-day war because the missiles have been so successful, we're faced with a government in Tehran which is too dominated by reformists who are willing to appear to be the most naive people on earth and to negotiate in good faith with the US as if that's going to actually get them anywhere. Whereas what has to happen in order for Pax Judaica to be defeated, in order for the Zionists to be defeated, in order for the Jewish state to be removed, dismantled, there needs to be a conflict. Iran and the Axis resistance need to take the hard decision that there will never be peace, that things will get consistently worse while the Zionists are able to do what they want in welding this regional wide or even beyond the region alliance of power. Then there is no alternative but to collapse the Zionist entity. And I don't believe that we have I think there is the wherewithal, but I don't think that there is the will to do that at present. And I think that's one of the key reasons why we are heading faster and faster towards Pax Judaica.
For me, I think if Iran is not going to make several nuclear weapons, I don't even think it's worth discussing the axis of resistance anymore. They're just outgunned, outmatched in terms of the weapons and the technology. You can't. The only advantage Iran has and that the Axis had for a time were their missiles, and their missiles were impressive. Um, but even Hezbollah was defeated because they couldn't fire the missiles. That's ultimately what it came down to. The Israelis just kept taking out the launchers. They don't have to take out the missiles that are hidden underground. Hezbollah could have 90% of their rockets left. If you can't launch them, you can't.
Yeah.
They're useless. And so, and we saw Iran did a good job continuing to fight during the 12 days, but Israel took out a portion of their launchers, and so they were forced to fire from further in the interior. And that required them using their better, more sophisticated, newer rockets because they can fly farther and more accurate. And they've been trying to upgrade them. But the point is, their missiles are their only advantage, but they don't have an endless supply of them. And if you can't launch all of them forever, then that advantage, which is the only one you have, is stripped away from you. And so if it's not tipped with a nuclear weapon, you're not going to pose much of a threat to the Zionists. And so I don't even think it's worth discussing anymore if they're not going to build a nuclear weapon, in my view. But so for that reason, the only hope I have left, and I'm surprised you haven't mentioned it, is the political development taking place in the United States. The collapse of Zionist support amongst the public in the United States. Do you view this as a threat to Israel and their vision and their desire and their chasing of a Jewish empire?
Yes, it's a threat, but the threat has to be made material for it to make any difference. I mean, nobody in the US and the UK post Thatcher and Reagan believes that there is any form of democratic relationship between public opinion and domestic policy, never mind foreign policy, which is way above the pay grade of all voters. So unless it's made material, that's not going to make any difference. And is it going to be made material? Is Zoran Mamdani going to rout the Zionists of New York? Does he have a plan for closing down the thousands of Zionist organizations based in New York, which are on a daily basis helping to continue the genocide by sending money and resources and indeed people to fight in Palestine? Is he going to find a way to clear out the NYPD of its Zionist links and its links with the IDF, its links with the ADL? Is he going to find a way to shut down the ADL? Well, no, he's not even going to try to do any of that stuff. And that's what's required. And that's why it's important that there are people who are attempting to shut down Israeli arms firms, attempting to target Zionist organizations. That's the only way they can be defeated. They have to be defeated not just in Palestine, but in New York, in Chicago, in San Francisco.
Right. Well, I don't think it's Zoran and the left that could do it. I think it's Fuentes and the Groypers. I think that movement is more influential than people give it credit for, and it's spreading very quickly. I mean, there was some kind of, I think the New York Times, I don't know how accurate this is, but they're saying like 40 to 50% of the staffers who now work, and the staffers are generally younger people, right, from Fuentes' generation. But these staffers that work for the Republican congressmen are all Groypers. They all are essentially America First, and they view the Zionist Jews as having too much influence. And Tucker Carlson, he kind of flirts with this in a very subtle way. He's indirect on purpose. But what he and I think a lot of other people are saying is that the Jews have way too much power in the United States, and they are leveraging our institutions to benefit Israel more than they benefit the United States. And so this is kind of, I don't know how to say this without sounding anti-Semitic, to be completely honest with you. But it sounds like the only way to stop this is to purge Zionist Jews from their positions of power and also purge them of their wealth. Like if Larry Ellison, okay, let's say America, decides to not give Israel that much money or that many weapons. They reduce it. If Larry Ellison still runs the Oracle and he has control of all your data, and he's just one, right? I mean, there's so many others, right? And as you described, they're all over the world and they're in every industry. I mean, who is this Zionist Jewish congressman? He's like a gas mogul or an oil mogul, a tycoon who's talking about basically taking over Syria's energy industry. I mean, they're in every industry, and the most concerning of which, obviously, is artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
The top dogs in AI are Zionist Jews.
Yeah.
And they are building something that is supposedly going to usher in a new era of technology, which will be used for control and wealth gathering and power. And so the story isn't complete yet, but it's almost complete. And I feel like the only thing that can stop them is not actually um, the axis of resistance. I think it's anti-Semitism. I don't know how to say it in any other way. It's Christian nationalists in the United States saying the Jews have too much power, and if we don't stop them, they're gonna take over everything, and they're gonna subjugate all of us. And so I'm not happy to say that, but honestly, I feel like that's what it is. That's what.
Well, I mean, we do have to talk about dismantling Zionist power uh, in the UK and the US, and that does involve closing down Zionist institutions, jailing Zionists who've been involved in crimes, and finding ways to limit the power of Zionists such that there is democratic power so that people can vote for what they want to happen, and that can't be subverted by those who are the oligarchs. So, of course, that means, maximally, it means not just closing Zionist organizations, not just putting Zionists in jail. It does mean dismantling and neutering corporations which are run by Zionists. I mean, I think that's inevitable. Now, I don't think that's the same thing as anti-Semitism at all. It's not a form of racism which sees the Zionists as having racial characteristics. On the contrary, it's very much about.
No, I just mean the call to essentially jail Zionists who are Jews. Uh, the majority of Jews are Zionists, as you said. But the
Sure.
call to say what you just said, you said it in a much friendlier way, I think. But just the idea, I mean, because that's what the Zionists will say, right? Like, this is anti-Semitic. This is what Hitler
Sure.
did. This is what the Nazis did. They identified Jewish people and said, you are not truly loyal to us. You may be German, but you have more loyalty to other Jews and Israel, which at the time didn't exist yet. But you are not loyal to the state. That you are loyal to something else. It's not us, and you're acquiring this wealth and power to subjugate us and leverage our tools and our wealth to meet your goals. And this was the argument that I guess you could say that the Nazis made, and they began addressing that problem, right? So I'm not saying all Zionist Jews should be rounded up, but in the process of dismantling these institutions and jailing these billionaires and stripping them of their assets, right?
Sure.
I don't. It's difficult to explain and to
Well,
express, but I think you get my point.
It's called dezionization, right? I mean, it's exactly the same as was agreed by the Allies in Yalta in 1944 that there should be denazification. And the way in which that operates, it was most pursued by the Soviet Union. The British and the Americans didn't care. French did a little bit. And what happened was that there were several thousand, I believe it's 3,500 Nazis, Ukrainian Nazis in a holding camp in Italy were sent to the UK. And some of them were put in a camp in Lockerbie in the south of Scotland, which still exists. There's still a monument there to it. And after a year of denazification, which didn't involve anything at all, they were let go. And they were people who then mainly went to Canada. Chrystia Friesland, the Canadian, foreign secretary, her grandfather was one of them. And of course, some of them now are involved in Nazi atrocities in Ukraine. But so that's a model of how not to do denazification. It needs to be a way of not of stopping them committing crimes and starting to make inroads on the ideas which cause them to commit the crimes. Now, there are plenty of historical precedents for that. In the case of Algeria, what happened in the colony there was that most of the colonists left. Now, that's one way to solve the problem in Palestine. But the other way, of course, is over a period of years for the material determinants and material underpinnings of Zionism to be removed, and the ideas will then dissipate. So, for example, in the what became the Republic of Ireland, it became a free state in 1921 when they kicked the British out of the 26 counties, but the British remained. They had two bases in what was the Free State. They were eventually kicked out of those bases in 1948. But by 1948, or 20 years after that, by 68, most of the Protestants in the South who would not accept that they should become Irish had abandoned the idea that they were British because there was no material underpinning. It wasn't coming back, and they became, as almost all Irish Protestants in the South, in the Republic, are now, they became Irish Protestants. And that's what has to happen, right? We have to move to people becoming Jewish citizens of the UK or the US, as opposed to genocide heirs who want to put the interests of Israel first and who say that they want to. I mean, the best example is the example of Jake Wallace Simons, until recently the editor of the Jewish Chronicle in the UK, and he gave an interview to the Guardian 15 years ago now, I think it was, where he said that the Jewish school I was at, we used to have this argument about what will we do in an armed conflict between Israel and Britain, and of course all my friends said they would fight for the IDF. Now that's in a period where we weren't even in the genocide, and so that's what has to be tackled. Those sets of ideas which puts the defense of the Jewish state above humanity, essentially. Now, is that anti-Semitism to want to destroy those ideas? No, of course not. It's anti-racist.
Very well said. I appreciate you commenting on that. So we've been talking now for over an hour. I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I know we initially said this would be maybe just 30 minutes. I knew it wasn't going to be. It took you just 30 minutes to get through point one. But it was a very interesting conversation, and I think a very, very important one. And so I'm very appreciative of you taking the time to speak with me today, and I can't wait to share this with my audience.